right. All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's excellent to be here. I've seen so many people that I admire grace this stage. So before I get into it, I really want to express my gratitude to FWB Fest and everyone's that's supported me on this journey to get to this point. So yeah, it's a really great experience to be here to come and share my thoughts. It's a very special atmosphere, as we all know, at FWB Fest, and in my opinion, quite a bright spot in turbulent times. So, who am I? My name's Edmond Lau, and some of you may better know me as Nostalgia Expressway, or the guy in yellow with the yellow dot on Twitter who posts too many memes about Lil Arbo. But more seriously, though, I'm a writer and a cultural strategist working in consumer, crypto, luxury, and new media. You may have seen some of my work around the internet on LinkedIn or Substack or in the media, like this luxury pyramid that when it popped off a bit, hopefully gave everyone a bit of a laugh, or this clout matrix from more recently. And I've also worked with some of the companies you might see around the crypto sphere. So FWB, of course, IYK Seed Club, which you may be familiar with, and then some more trad companies, not trad, but what I mean is Web2, GQ, Pangaea, Protein. That is actually a bit Web3. So, why are we here today? Well, earlier this year, Matt Klein and I published a piece entitled The Dark Mode Shift, where we unpacked what we saw as a broad cultural slide from light mode optimism to dark mode disillusionment. So our theory was that the ZIRP, so zero interest rate percentage, fueled 2010s had lulled us into a collective delusion, a smooth fantasy of uninterrupted tech progress and steady social liberalization, where a better world always seemed just right around the corner. And it wasn't just us either. Rather, the dark mode shift formed part of an entire genre of commentary that seemed to observe this darker, cynical turn. So, in addition to us, we had Sean Monahan writing about boom, boom, yuppies and the return of 80s hustler culture. New York Magazine writing about the cruel kids table. So, youth conservatism, and futurist Carl Shaker writing around recession indicators. But what is dark mode? Well, dark mode is best understood in contrast to light mode. And born in the wake of the GFC, the global financial crisis, at a time when institutional trust had collapsed to all-time lows, light mode optimism functioned as this kind of aesthetic placebo, an illusion designed to make us believe that things were changing for the better, even if materially they hadn't. The rules of polite society under light mode were simple. Hide your wealth. Celebrities, they're just like us. Pretend we're all in it together and outsource your moral compass to branding. Your boss cares about the gays, your startup is saving the planet, and premium mediocre consumption is not just a status symbol, but a form of virtue. So I like to think about this COVID meme of, Anne Hathaway as somebody's HR director, firing someone during the pandemic over Zoom. Or Kendall Jenner saving the world with a Pepsi, which I really hoped that would have worked. Okay, so what followed then is dark mode. So in the wake of the pandemic of global stagnation, dark mode is a cultural pivot to cynicism and nihilism. And for some, it meant giving up entirely. After all, if the system's rigged, why bother? But for others, it meant throwing out the rules and securing the bag by any means necessary. And for the lucky few, it means being able to victory lap without shame. But either way, we had gone mask off. And over the recent past, dark mode has played out across culture and commerce. The military-industrial complex used to be something that was quite hidden, and now you have Anduril using anime to sell you cruise missiles through TikToks. Or here we have Palantir, it's a bit covered up by the tree, but advertising on college campuses, talking about a moment of reckoning arriving for the West. And also, on the same in the same vein, a lot of college students are also turning towards the military-industrial complex as a form of, a safe career option. So it's, kind of more secure in the bag as well. And then on the realm of consumer marketing, we also have, in fashion, for example, a return to more formal clothing, kind of suiting up as a battle of armor. And then you have music as well, kind of becoming rawer. So you have FKA Twigs, for example, McGee, Netspend, all kind of arriving in this new era of artists that are more gritty and rawer than ever. But it's very easy to think about doom and gloom and wallow in it, right? But so to that end, what I really wanted to do today was explore ways to reboot ourselves. And so on that agenda, first I wanted to look further into the responses to dark mode. So how are people actually responding to dark mode and what are the archetypes of it? Following this, I want to explore the concept of meta-sincerity, of meta-modernity, which I believe will be the key to leading ourselves out of the darkness. And finally, I want to conclude with some practical things that we can do to hopefully work our way out of the dark. So, as I mentioned before, responses to the calamity of dark mode span from sheer nihilism to hyper-competitive self-optimization. But at this core of each perspective lies this understanding of self-reliance. Nothing and nobody is going to save you, so either you save yourself or you are resigned to not making it. So here, if everything is rigged, why bother? These are the people that aren't going to make it. They are the people that kind of are in that wallowing state, and whether temporarily or permanently, they're choosing to opt out. So movements like nothing ever happens, or in China, for example, tangping, or lying flat, are kind of echoes of a capitalistic system that is designed with apparent appearance of progress, but for many, they don't feel that it's happening. So again, if everything is rigged, then why bother trying? But it's not just pure nihilism, it's also a sense of logic, because if the system is, to these people, rigged against you, then why bother fighting it? It's a means to escape psychological pain of failure by accepting that your fate is predetermined. The next is the Hustle Bros or the Anna Delvey related genre. I don't think there's a name for Hustle Bros for women or non-binary people yet. If someone knows of one, please do tell me. But these are those that acknowledge the game's ruthless nature and choose to play for survival or simply to embrace vice in a moment where consequences feel arbitrary. So in a world where nothing makes sense, the strategy is to rapidly self-optimize in anticipation of a lawless state of nature. So like I said, these are your Patrick Batemans and your Anna Delveys. And then finally, those like the Zuck that are just unapologetically outlandish. These are the people who found permission through dark mode to be actively, unabashedly shameless. So like I mentioned before, Anduril making bomb memes, Zuckerberg. Essentially, these are those that have won in the system and see no purpose in reining in their excesses. So to this group, we used to have this idea of a noblesse oblige, but right now, noblesse oblige is for losers. Yeah, so these are the kind of three archetypes, and they're different responses to dark mode. But in terms of kind of overall theme, it's an abandonment of virtue and an embracing of vice. It can be both, or it can be one or the other. And each of these responses, resignation, extraction, or outlandish provocation, reflects this shared psychic baseline that we're in, a loss of faith in systems, narratives, and meaning. Now, if we're going to talk about dark mode, we also should interrogate some of the key criticism behind it. Firstly, aren't we living in the best time in human history? In some respects, we are, yes. So some statistics, such as infant mortality, global poverty, incidences of HIV and AIDS are the lowest that they've ever been. Yet we're also aware that experiences are also relative. We are also living in the time where millennials are the first in their generation to be less well off of their predecessors. And despite earning more when adjusting for inflation, the cost of living increases have far outstripped the increases in higher nominal wages. And at the same time, I also want to mention that there is a focus on hyper-rationality as well, which is kind of missing the forest for the trees. There is a common refrain, which I'm sure you've all heard: facts don't care about your feelings. But to that, I would also say feelings don't necessarily always care about facts. And that's important because humans are ultimately irrational creatures, and by acting through irrationality, we also create reality. So feelings are important. Not to mention, from an emotional view, things aren't very crash hot either. So the recent 2025 Edelman Trust Barometer, so this is a global survey of over 33,000 respondents on institutional trust, found that only 36% of respondents believe that things will be better for the next generation. And in developed countries, just 1 in 5 see a better future. Meanwhile, 4 in 10 approve of at least one form of hostile activism, so attacking people online, intentionally spreading disinformation, threatening or committing violence, or damaging things. So you will see people, making memes about like Luigi, for example, and you're not quite sure whether they're joking or not. And so it's quite a rocky state out there. The second thing is, hasn't hyper-individualism been around all this time? And the difference is that, yes, it has always existed, but the difference is that what was once subtext, the hustle, the nihilism, the isolation, is not fringe right now, it's pure text. When we first had, these kind of fringe theories, fringe expressions of culture, they were expressions of a turn inward, but they weren't the mainstream. They were treated as aberrations rather than the dominant view. Okay, so where does that actually leave us? Well, in my view, the dark mode shift might actually be a good thing. In the original piece, I invoked the red pill as a metaphor for waking up. It may have its associations with the political right and the manosphere, but ironically, the coastal liberal elite, people like us, are undergoing this red pilling of their own, in that the status quo isn't quite working for them either. And part of what I want to talk about when we come to what I'm about to speak about, meta-modernity, is that there is an oscillation between cynicism and optimism that is necessary for bringing about kind of a cultural rebirth. But the benefit of red pilling, or embracing darkness, or going through this period of realizing that we are much more polarized than it seems, it's only by recognizing our societal ills, to BSOD, that we can reboot towards something better. Meta-modernity is then what happens next. So, as I said, we oscillate from we're so back to it's so over, and then back to we're so back. So what is meta-modernity? Meta-modernity is an oscillation between a modernist enthusiasm and postmodern irony. Sorry, excuse me 1 second. It acknowledges the turbulence of the present, but does not lean into the easy refuge of nihilism. They do not retreat into pure irony, nor do they blindly cling to the ghosts of futures past. Instead, the meta-modernist understands turbulence as a necessary precondition for transformation. If light mode was this corporate false hope of pastel optimism, and dark mode is the resulting cultural burnout, then meta-modernism is that secret third thing. And I would wager that meta-modernity is also on the rise, because dooming really just doesn't hit like it used to. In his recent piece on post-doomerism, Al-Hassan Ewan tracks a series of cultural tremors that that suggests this shift is already in place. So we have TikTok, Hope Core edits, Peter Limberg on internet realism, all suggest a tide turning towards against incessant dooming. And the reason for that is dooming is ultimately quite exhausting. And just like your friend that really can't help themselves, eventually everyone kind of runs out of patience. We're really trying to feel things again, albeit in quotation marks. We're not denying collapse, but we're simply accepting that while it may be a possibility, what do we do with that? What does trying again look like? History also shows us that darkness is never completely the end of the road, but often the beginning of a redirection. Civilizations don't reboot when things are easy. If we rewind to different historical events, we can start to see a pattern. So after the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe entered centuries of stagnation and decay, but what came afterward was the Renaissance, a rediscovery of ancient texts, a reimagining of human potential through art, science, and civic life. The Black Death wiped out 60% of Europe's population. But when everything falls apart, people start asking different questions. And when things are looking like they're on the edge of collapse, this sort of proximity panic prompts people to think about what could potentially result in newer futures. Likewise, if we look at the oil crisis in the 1970s and stagflation, that eventually gave way to the boom 80s and deregulation. And then on the flip side, if we look at the end of the Cold War, it gave way to the freewheeling 90s and this proclamation by Francis Fukuyama that we're at the end of history and the triumph of liberal democracy. But ultimately, we now know that that didn't completely pan out to be the case. So again, we can kind of establish this cyclical loop. So roughly we can see that these transitions follow a loose pattern from collapse, existing narratives, systems, and institutions lose credibility. And then we have crisis, a shock event, pandemic, war, financial crash breaks cultural inertia. And the reevaluation, a hunger emerges for new ideas, new stories, and new leadership. And then we have reconstruction. Meaning is reassembled, but not necessarily from scratch. And what's important to note here is that change doesn't come from returning to old ideals or thinking that things are just going to go back to where they were. History rhymes, but it does not repeat. Rather, it comes from metabolizing the failures that we've experienced and coming out with something new. So ultimately, what I believe is that dark mode is not a precursor for collapse, but a precursor for rebirth. Seem to be having a technical issue with slides here, but we will carry on. So let's talk about how we actually get to this stage of meta-sincerity if this prediction is correct. And we're witnessing a meta-modern turn. So what are the possible triggers that might tilt us towards the light? The first is earnestness or sincerity, or in short, basically, to be cringe is to be free. For a generation that's been raised in the internet's social panopticon, the cardinal sin of being online today is to do something cringe. But it is only through kind of embracing cringe and embracing your humanity that something really new can emerge from that. Writer Elisabetta Federmesser recently had a fantastic piece where she says that cringe can send shivers down your spine, but in that it kind of pokes through at the human experience, and ultimately it can create something that is ultimately sublime. The same way, I think Susan Sontag, when she talks about camp, quite often things fail because they are mediocre, because they are of limited ambition, but being cringe ultimately means cracking through to something and being proud of the attempt, even ultimately it is embarrassing. The second point I want to talk about is authenticity. So currently we're in a state of kind of AI slop really dominating dominating the airwaves. And this is also relating to cringe culture and sincerity, but embracing imperfection means embracing authenticity of ourselves and the human and our imperfections as humans. So I'd like to draw on Nikita Walia's example of artisanal reality. And she thinks about artisanal reality not as pure earnestness, but it's designed to craft work that is designed to read as human in an increasingly optimized visual culture. It relies on intentional imperfection, admissions of cosmetic procedures, grainy textures, visible pores, that kind of thing. It's not necessarily saying that you have to completely walk away from preened perfection, but more so talk about the way that we got there in the end, and in doing so kind of bringing us closer together. Embracing this imperfection is also tied towards the meta-modern impulse. It doesn't demand flawless sincerity, nor does it kind of reject flaws, but it kind of lives in this tension between the two, allowing both to coexist and hopefully signaling humanity and the chance to kind of come together. We are living in a time when social atomization is at an all-time high, and ultimately the fact that we are all mediated through screen is one of them. So if we can get to a point where we are able to embrace flaws in how we present ourselves online, it really does act as a reminder that there is a real person on the other end, and perhaps that may be the antidote towards some of this social atomization. The third thing that I want to raise with how meta-modernity could prompt as a trigger out of the darkness is slow tech. So if TikTok is fast food, then slow tech is farm to table. It is what happens when a generation raised on frictionless feeds starts craving some friction. You may have seen, many kind of projects that are familiar to FWB, such as USB Club, for example, where the tech is used with some sort of intention and connection to the tangible world that introduces a degree of friction, but still uses technology in intentional ways. The concept isn't particularly new, but it is a worthy counter to a Silicon Valley obsession with speed and efficiency. They are tools that invite reflection rather than reaction, not because necessarily slowness is inherently virtuous, but it's really thinking about how technology can be used as in service of humanity rather than extractive of humanity. We have rising of things like the dark forest web, for example, things like Arena, which are all things that let you kind of get off the script away from the algorithm. And so it doesn't resist the idea of technology itself, but the cultural dispositions that have started to surround it. It's important to remember that when the internet came about, it was a neutral tool. So being online isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is useful to reframe how we use the internet and think about whether it's actually a good thing for ourselves. The final point that I want to touch on is myth. And if you're trying to convince someone, facts don't really quite work anymore because we're living in a state where everyone has different sets of facts, and objective truth seems to be an afterthought. But the key point about myth is that they offer this symbolic, allegorical lens through which we can understand complex truths without claiming to be truth themselves. And this is an antidote to the idea of a post-truth society. We want to consider how in ancient culture, take Greek mythology, for example, there may have been, gods and goddesses, but they were really reflections of the human experiences, whether it was love or war or anything in between. And when it comes to the idea of the meta-modern, it allows for shared beliefs when facts are no longer shared. So when objective truth has been so fragmented, the idea of myths allow a way to come back to optimism in the face of a lack of objective shared truth.
we talk about myths in terms of ancient Chinese myths or the Greek, ancient Greek religion, but I also want to think about this in the context, more contemporary context. The myths of national identity, as our friend in the audience, Reggie James, mentioned, is also an important type of myth. Likewise, when we talk about consumer brands as well, a luxury brand, for example, is basically relying on a myth to sell you products. So in all of these cases, myth is a pathway to connection. So where are we headed now? Where does this all leave us? After all the tech, after all the dark times, the self-optimization, the nihilism, what are we all left with? The path forward is ultimately messy and it's oscillating. And it's definitely not going to be, the path forward is definitely not going to be found in some neatly packaged ideology. But what I'm offering through with meta-modernity is the idea that we can rebuild, if not from the ground up, then at least from a place of intention and awareness. What meta-modernism really offers us is a way to exist between cynicism and optimism when it comes to earnestness and sincerity. It allows us to really be ourselves, accepting that there is cringe, but there is beauty in cringe. When it comes to our use of technology, it's accepting that technology is always going to be around, and we can't completely unplug, but we can think about using it intentionally. And then when it comes to myth, it's accepting that we can, despite the fact that we lack a shared truth, we can still come together and hopefully rebuild the ground for objective truth. And in the end, it comes really back to a certain pragmatism that you actually really don't know whether there is a future or not. Really, some people might be right in saying that we're not going to make it, but it's really a choice up to you whether you choose to believe it. And what I want to leave you with now is that whether there is a future or not, there is definitely beauty in the attempt. I think we have some time, so if anybody has questions, yeah.
So in the beginning, when we were kind of going over the sort of archetypes of people that, in a way, they respond to this kind of, this kind of dark moment, I guess.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people categorize somebody who they would categorize this person under like the doomer, I guess. But I'm curious what you think about somebody who might consider themselves like a socialist, and who, especially considering like in June the election of Miller, and how much of a huge kind of, for lack of a better term, vibe shift caused. I'm curious as to what role you think those kind of people play in this kind of, future that you described.
I mean, I think it's really, what I want to say about this is that, signals like that point towards kind of the cyclical change that I was talking about earlier. So ultimately, when things aren't working as they should, and there is a lot of, grievance, then, the emergence of new narratives is basically what's necessary for that reboot to occur. So events like that are really kind of, signals that this kind of, we're moving past complete darkness and into something new again. Ready?
Going back to sort of even how we describe sort of doom, I think one thing I was curious to push on is like maybe the political presupposition there, right? So something you mentioned is like working on the military-industrial complex, right? So if you're more to the left, that might seem dark if you are, but to folks growing up in earlier time in America, like serving your country was seen as this national responsibility, and it's actually something that we should be encouraging. If you look to China, there's a lot of pride put into their national capabilities. So I'm curious, like, when we talk about doom, those aren't necessarily shared, and how do we sort of look at that across political?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, and you know, I think that's quite a difficult and complex one. And it's actually something interesting is that, you know, this idea of you know, dark mode and light mode may be a phenomenon that is, you know, quite relative. But I think, you know, in the same vein, earlier, you know, during the talk when I mentioned, you know, are we like living in the best time ever? You know, I think there is this kind of like lack of like, you know, objective truth or objective like agreement about what state we're in. So some people might say actually like, you know, probably, you know, like half of the population of the US right now may think that there's a lot of like this type of culture is actually, you know, like a really positive thing. But to me, I think, you know, dark mode was not necessarily about whether you think it's, you know, good or bad, but I think, you know, something like the political, like the military-industrial complex is more like a reflection of unabashed, like, you know, aggression. And it's not necessarily a value judgment about whether that is a good or a bad thing, but more that it is simply, you know, the military of, like, I guess is like, you know, you would think about it as something that's aggressive, just as a concept. So that's kind of where I would put it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whether or not.
Sorry?
I said whether or not I agree is separate, but I think that's good.
Yeah. Okay. I think, yeah, definitely when it came to institutional trust, 40% of, actually like, no industry breached 40% in terms of institutional trust. Like in terms of like, is this industry trustworthy? I think it was only agriculture and farmers that was at, I think, 46%, so nothing was over 50%. So I think there is a very, like, you know, extreme lack of trust, which was very quite, I was in awe of that, you know, or, for example, like, you know, 40% of people were in favor of some sort of hostile activism, which was really kind of a symbolic of how polarized we are. I think that's about it. Oh, thank you for everyone for coming on.